Good afternoon, my fellow students. It is fine day of spring, and we have experienced long winter days. I hope you have spent the winter vacation very helpfully and usefully for your study and a career ambition. So it is very exotic and interesting to meet you on the cyberspace. The globalization and technological development enabled us to study comparative law by this way of delivery. I hope it to be productive to strengthen your study purpose. As I have introduced in the classroom, you will be exposed the key information about this class. So we have 14 weeks to get through the briefs of a comparative law as an academic discipline. In this week, we have an overview about the definition of comparative law and the goals and methods of comparative law, and also the uses of comparative law. So the first topic we have to think about is what comparative law is. Although comparative law is a widely used term, competitors tend to feel somewhat uncomfortable with it. Like its Russian language counterpart, a strip or a bravo, it sounds as though it might refer to a separate branch of law or to process of placing statute books or court reports from different legal systems side by side and comparing legal rules or holding of cases without regard for their or important legal and social context, not to mention how they work in practice. So it is to avoid these connotations that the American Association of Comparatives is known as the American Association for the Comparative Study of Law, rather than for the study of comparative law. And our German colleagues speak of a race rather than vulgarized rate. This is to emphasize that comparative law is, as the last Sir Otto Confront put it, a variety of methods for looking at law. So we have actually a difficulty about a clear understanding of comparative law. It submits to a variety of way of a approach in ways of a contemplation and the methodology itself. But we have several points on negative context which facilitates our understanding about comparative law. First, comparative law is not the study of one foreign legal system or part of one foreign system. And it is not an elementary account of various legal systems or of various families of systems. And it is also not merely a matter of drawing comparisons. Comparative law is certainly something other than the study of one foreign system with glance at one's own. An overall look at the world systems or comparison of individual rules or branches of law as between two or more systems. It is the study of the relationship of one legal system and its rules with another. I suppose you have massive experience about the national laws, including a Korean civil law or a American case law or other a German statute law. So we are quite well acquainted with the generally speaking, in the national context of law. So we are experts of national law if we graduate from this law school. But there are less chances to meet a comparative experience in terms of a study or research and in practical implications over a legal practitioners or a law reformers or others. But you may an expert of a specific provision of statute, and you are a great interpreter to get practical meaning to be applied to the case you have dealt with a significant context about the actual settings or in the courtroom. But would it be that all? You may suppose a kind of globalization trend in the contemporary times, and you may have many kinds of a diverse activity around us. You may have a foreign clients to seek your advice about a investment in Korea. So, as one scholar pointed out, the national law in a pure knowledge and experience can hardly deal with the issues involved a circuitry to address in this contemporary time if they are novice of a comparative and or no or less experience about a comparative law. So it is, I suppose, essential in contemporary times to understand the brief of a comparative methodology and a way of a thinking and a practical implications the comparative studies brings us in understanding the laws more thoroughly and contextually. Two essential ingredients of comparative law would be on a legal history and nature of law. Legal history is really important to understand the laws in its historical context. They may borrow the laws from other countries, and they may interchange in equal power to share the essence of laws or others. And we also need to be a philosopher of law who is eagerly delving on the nature of law, which means the legal philosophy is critically interacting to get the gist of a comparative understanding of law. Particularly, we have to shed a focus on the nature of legal development. And we have next an issue about three types of relationships. How the different laws interact to develop a legal culture or a tradition. Of course, in its final forms, we may have a reform statute, a better law, in reflection of a past evils or faults. So, as I've introduced, a borrowing is a fourth type. The different laws interact. Some spirit culture may be a modality that the more inferior a state may employ to cultivate or actually enact the kind of the laws. And the other type of a relationship would be called a inner relationship. This is a kind of a equal context between two different legal traditions. And lastly, same or similar stages of development shared at earlier days of legal systems. So these are major components when we understand the relationship between the legal traditions. Along with this study, you need to be aware of the term legal transplant. We have also an experience about this concept. We are generally considered to be a progeny of a German civil tradition. And by way of a Japanese imperialism, the Korean laws were germinated by a way of influence from Japanese rulers. So in this context, we use the term legal transplant. This term was coined in the 1970s by the Scottish-American legal scholar, the Reverend Alan Watson, to indicate the moving of a rule or a system of law from one country to another. So it was accepted from Watson legal transplants, an approach to comparative law, was published in Edinburgh in 1974. The notion of legal transplantation is diffusionism based, and according to this concept, most changes in most legal systems occur as a result of borrowing. As maintained by Watson, transplantation is the most fertile source of legal development. Laws are commonly inspired by foreign policies and experiences, regardless of the academic discourse on whether legal transplants are sustainable as a notion in the legal theory. They are common practice. Nevertheless, the degree to which new laws are inspired by foreign examples can vary. A frequent and often justified criticism is that imported laws are not suited for certain local context. So you may have some kind of exotic introduction about a legal transplant. It is a kind of perspective that the imperial states consider the interchange of a legal culture. And in this case, the superior law is very forceful, have a great potency to implant the legal culture and values into the conquered states. So this term is kind of a negative nuance when we see this contemporary international politics in terms of more egalitarian dynamics. And also German jurist Friedrich von Savigny and his historical school of jurisprudence, which was inspired by the 19th century Romanticism, have notably promoted the origins of German people and the distinctive ethos or Volksgeist, the spirit of people. Savigny is one of a very influential comparativist, and his effort now contributes very much in over a broad range of conflict of law questions. And his concept is largely a rule other than a exception, and very prevailing over both legal traditions, notwithstanding a continental or a common law tradition. Savigny's school of legal thought expressed the need of legal change to respect the community of the Volksgeist, offering a pre-Darwin concept of juristic evolution. However, this concept of juristic evolution did not leave much space for notions such as legal transplants and the diffusion of law. In the recent time, Pierre Legan was one of the strongest opponents of legal transplants. Today, legal transplants are often mentioned in the broader process of diffusion of law or legal acculturation. J.W. Powell, who is an American legal scholar, has offered a kind of a mixed view about interchange of a legal tradition. a more modest connotation may be given to you, acculturation. The word acculturation would be better than legal implant in our linguistic sense. First, using it in an 1880 report by the U.S. Bureau of American Ethnography, explained that this term refers to the psychological change induced by cross-cultural limitation. In a broad context, such notion is by many contemporary scholars applied to legal thought. The diffusion of law is a process of legal change in today's age of globalization. Studies on diffusion of law are notably a new area of research in the 24th century. So we have a brief visit to the term legal transplants, and I now add some of a basic information about the more a sublime form of a legal transplant through has many points of proposition. In legal transplants, wrote by Alan Jefferson in the University Press of Virginia. His article featured in University Press of Virginia. We have some essence of his argument. What is comparative law? The question is often put: the range of reply is startling. An extreme but not uncommon opinion is it does not exist. So it is difficult to get the true feature of a legal transplant or comparative law. It is fully conceded no comparative branch of law in the sense in which lawyers call one branch of law family law or another mercantile law. Guthridge tells us that the emptiness of the phrase comparative law has been realized by German-speaking lawyers who use the term Rechtsbegründung, which connotes a process of comparison and is free from any implications of the existence of a body of laws forming a separate branch or department of law. He also points out that the strangeness of the English term becomes manifest when attempts are made to define comparative law or to explain its relation to other forms of learning. So, our first-hand impression about the subject of comparative would be like this: a comparative law generally denotes a method of study and research, or is a technique. But is that correct, or accurately covers the whole true whole and true feature of a comparative law? We legitimately lodge a question about this definition. What is this method or technique? The student will find that the question tends to remain unanswered, and that the writer, having claimed that comparative law is a method, simply proceeds: the method called comparative law can be used for a variety of practical or scholarly purposes. Presumably, such a writer is of the opinion that the nature of the method or technique is obvious. But if the nature of comparative law is obvious, it can only be the investigation of legal rules and procedures, not of one system in isolation, but in harness with the examination of the equivalent rules and procedures in at least one other system. If we stick to this a narrow understanding of comparative law, we may have a take of a variety of informations produced by a scattered country across the globe. Is there a true feature on the test about a comparative endeavor? It is not so. It can be partly true, but it is not exactly answered about many other kinds of dynamics found in a comparative law discipline. Other jurists have held comparative law is not simply a method, but a science with its own distinct province. But there is no agreement as to what the province is, and the debate as to whether comparative law is a method or science had turned into a debate of language. More of theories, the comparative law is a science, now seem to lack support. So we need to have some thought about the identity of comparative law in terms of a science concern. A more promising approach has been to hold that more than one discipline is included within the term of comparative law. Lambert, for instance, was responsible for threefold division. Comparative law may be dissected into three spheres, what we call descriptive comparative law, and comparative history of law, and comparative legislation. What is first? First of this is the inventory of the system of the past and present as a whole, as well as of individual rules which these systems establish for the several categories of legal relations. What is comparative history of law in our next consideration? Lambert tells us is closely allied to ethnological jurisprudence, folklore, legal sociology, and philosophy of law. It endeavors to bring out through the establishment of universal history of law the rhythms or natural laws of succession of social phenomena which direct the evolution of legal institutions. And he has that his students have been up to the present principally interested in the reconstitution of the most obscure phases of the legal history of human societies. The third branch, comparative legislation, represents the effort to define the common trunk on which present national doctrines of law are destined to graft themselves as a result both of the development of the study of law as a social science and of the awakening of an international legal consciousness. We shall be here concerned with an approach similar to that of Lambert or Wigmore. You may know Wigmore. He also divided comparative law in three: a comparative nomoscopy, which is the description of systems of law, and a comparative nomosetics, which is the analysis of the merits of systems, and comparative nomogenetics, which is the study of development of the whole the world's legal ideas and systems. But first of all, to clear the ground, we must say that what comparative law is now. So I have earlier introduced several kinds of a potential prejudice about understanding of a comparative law. Let's see, we study many foreign laws in the Department of Law. or American University of French private law, or detailed study of French contract law may have great intellectual and practical value, but it remains a course of French law, not comparative law. No doubt it is impossible to follow such a course without reflecting on and making comparisons with one's own law, and indeed without increasing one's understanding of one's own law. But this does not change the essential nature of the courses as French law. This remains true even where an expressed aim of the course is the insight it gives in domestic system. We may have insight and some kind of useful information from French law when we are challenged by our national laws, Korean law. But they are still a point of a French law. A comparative law means something a little different from a pure foreign laws. Secondly, an elementary account of various legal systems or various families of systems cannot be decently regarded as the proper pursuit of comparative law as an academic activity. The description lacks the necessary intellectual content. Thirdly, and more arguably, comparative law cannot be primarily a matter of drawing comparisons, as I have introduced. Those who disagree with this proposition proceed from one of two starting points. They may start from an individual legal problem, which they consider to be the same in more than one jurisdiction, and examine the legal response to it. As one scholar has put it, the fact that the problem is one and the same warrants the comparability. Do you agree? Or they may take a breach of law, say contract, and investigate in detail the differences and similarities of the individual rules. But it is very doubtful if the comparisons are justifiable in academic terms as comparative law, whether the starting point is the legal problem or the branch of the law. Variations in the political, moral, social, and economic values which exist between any two societies make it hard to believe the many legal problems are the same for both except on a technical level. For instance, the legal problem of rent restriction is not the same both in a country where rented accommodation is common and in a country where it is less common. The problem of alimony for divorced wives in a jurisdiction where it is usual for women to work differs from that in a country where women do not have jobs. The problem and the proper legal response to it may also be altered by the availability worldwide of crisis and nursery schools for young children and so forth. So the social and economic circumstances would well differ across each varying states. And later you may see the American system about labor law. The United States is a unique country which has now a labor law about the discharge of at-will employee. It is indeed a liberalistic and individualistic to address the kind of a labor relations between the employers and the employees. And the Constitution is also silent about any social agenda programs. It is absolutely on the side of a classical modality of a liberal constitution. So the social issues are a lot different to the legislature actually, and that is typical, but it has a reason and a kind of a historical context intervenes to produce that kind of a uniqueness. How do we understand this kind of a differences of the nature of law and a legal history? That is a simple illustration that we have to adhere through the courses of this subject. When the starting point is a branch of law, the difficulty arising from the variations of a political, moral, social, and economic factors for any varied comparison recedes to some extent, but is still very much present. Moreover, except where the systems are closely related, as in certain states in America, in comparison of legal rules may be intellectually meaningful, but the minor nature of differences which exist may limit the significance of the investigation. It is not surprising that Guthrie can write in the preface to his book on comparative law, no special form of technique seems to be called for if the comparison, as for instance, between Australian and Canadian law, between English law and the law of the United States. So there are kind of a scope of variations to intervene when we elaborate on a definition work about comparative law. So your understanding would be a little complex, and not you may not be exposed to some kind of a straightforward way or to look into the nature of a comparative law in more accurate or a foreground. Then I venture to suggest that the study is primarily a jurisprudential and is posed for the wide-held view that much of jurisprudence is unthinkable without comparisons from various systems. So that is a very basic niche that we have to strike through the achievement of a definition about a comparative law. So, comparative law, then, if it is to be an intellectual discipline in its own right, is something other than the study of one foreign system, as we have illustrated in the French law case in American or British universities. I would suggest that it is a study of a relationship of one legal system and its rules with another. So we have a second stage of leaf to highlight the feature of comparative law. When one comes to treat the growth of these similarities and differences across the different legal tradition, for instance, has it come about that France, Germany, and Switzerland all deriving their law from Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, have each different rules on the passing of risk and property in sale. One finds oneself better able to understand the particular factors which shape legal growth and change. Indeed, this may be the easiest approach to an appreciation of how law normally evolves. This seems a proper field of study of comparative law. So, in the second instance, I suggest the comparative law is about the nature of law, and especially about the nature of legal development. These two elements, which is very basic and fundamental about our way of understanding, coming from a study of the relationship between systems, legal history, and the step beyond into jurisprudence, are, I submit, the essential ingredients of comparative law as an intellectual discipline in its own right. So that is our first assignment in this week, to establish a kind of a common identification and some kind of a concrete definition about a comparative law. The importance of history behind the legal rules has in fact long been recognized by comparatists, and history is prominent in the writings of the most distinguished practitioners of the art. Witness, for instance, is J.P. Dawson, Unjust Enrichment. After Lawson, a common lawyer, looks at the civil law, which is published in Ann Arbor, 1953, and J.H. Merriman, the civil law tradition. R. David Ress, Grand System and Draw Contemporary, a fourth edition, published in Paris, 1971. And one other notable publication was made by Ocon and he, as a very simple lesson, but strikes through our minds of a comparative law. Let's say 400 years of legal and political history are reflected in the difference of techniques. How do you assess this phrase? It is very sensitizing through the churning of a comparative law. If this approach is right and comparative law is best regarded as a study of the relationship between systems of law, then it follows that where there is no relationship, there can be no comparative law, and any comparison drawn between rules will be arbitrary and without systemic worth. It thus becomes important to establish the nature of possible relationships. In the forefront, above all, stands the historical relationship, where one system or one of its rules derives from another system, probably with modification, where more than one system or rules of such systems derive from a follow system, or where derive is too strong a term, when one system exerts influence on another. The kind of interaction would be classed in kind of its way of interaction. So borrowing, inner relationships, or the third point of my classification would work to introduce you to this pattern of forms of relationships. In a general introductory work, this type of relationships should have pride of place. First, because the relationship itself is more obvious than any other type. Secondly, because degree of borrowing and adaptation is more easily spotted. Third, because the relevant factors in the development can be isolated more simply. And fourthly, because in the Western world, borrowing has been the usual way of legal development. Let's meet one other important maxim delivered by S.F. Schimmelson. He has spoken clearly. Societies largely invent their institutions, their political and administrative systems, even in these days, their economies. The private law is nearly always taken from others. Let's turn to see a second type of relationship. P. Frinsheim has called it the inner relationship. This rests not on any actual historical contact, but on a spiritual and psychical relationship, and on an undeniable similarity between the peoples as a prism things, or between their development. Comparative law can proceed from this inner relationship, but one must always bear in mind that the relationship itself is an unprovable hypothesis. In terms of Western civilization, This inner relationship is to be found, above all, between Roman and English law, and comparisons between the two have long been popular and fruitful. But the difficulties and dangers in this branch of study are obvious. The relationship cannot be closely defined. Its nature will not always be apparent. It will not exist in all areas or at all periods of development. And above all, there is no reasonably objective way of determining the importance of the similarities and differences which are observed. The great value of this branch of study lies in the light which it can shed on major legal matters. When English law has not been influenced by Roman law, it is of small significance. The detail is the same or is different in the two systems. But in contrast, the absence of the trust in Roman law and its prominence and usefulness in English law should make us more aware of the nature of the understand Roman law better by should make us more aware of the nature of the trust and of the factors in its development. So we may come to understand Roman law better by analyzing the lack of trust, the factors making it unnecessary or impossible for the Romans, and the institutions which took its place. There are complicated discourse about the interchange between the Roman law and English law, and it's difficult to see the dynamics in simple forms of understanding or simple way of dealings. But generally, those traditions are critically important to grasp the current form of a dissemination about a legal cultural system. They offer a pillars to both major legal traditions in this contemporary times, what I call a civil law tradition and common law tradition. And now we advance to a third relationship. This might be suggested by those scholars who believe that all legal systems in the young days pass through the same or similar stages of development. The general proposition is unsound, as we shall see, though between various early systems a historical relationship exists. Comparative law, then, as an academic discipline in its own right, is a study of the relationship. Above all, the historical relationship between legal systems, or between rules of more than one system. And this is the subject of our spring term in this course. When you consider the comparative law, we need to be aware of a interdisciplinary nature about a way of thinking. As I've already introduced, the history and the nature of law are two major essentials and a major tools to analyze the problems of a comparative law. And other branches of social science also factor to affect our understanding of comparative law, and it is a living creature to infuse its influence into a kind of legal system set forth in some kind of a specific settings. So comparative law by its very nature requires intercultural comparison and cross-disciplinary work. Ideally, the comparatists should have a grasp of history, law, economics, and sociology, as well as the necessary foreign language abilities. A person engaged in this task of comparing domestic and foreign law not only should have basic knowledge of the elements of the foreign law, including sources, structure, and characteristics, but should also comprehend the function of jurists within the system concerned. Some understanding of the social milieu wherein the legal rules are applied, including a familiarity with the political, economic, and cultural institutions of the country concerned, is desirable as well. In the words of a Guthrie, the laws must be examined in the light of their political, social, or economic purpose, and regard must be paid to their dynamic rather than their static or doctrinal aspects. So, your plain understanding would be enhanced if you think about the communist legal tradition. This term would encompass three major traditions, which is basically on Western modality, and which covers the civil and common law traditions, and lastly a socialist legal tradition. This plainly means that a political economy actively influences the legal system and its historical evolution. So we'll later get on detail about both aspects through the weeks. Let's see, a real problem arises when comparatives fail to distinguish between law in print and law in action. Between a mere paper legal institution and an institution as it actually functions. Ideally, a comparative should be comparing not laws as such, but the entire legal culture, the network values and attitudes relating to law and practices. So, also the dichotomy between a paper law and law in action would be concerned about a interdisciplinary nature of this subject. For the Western tradition being stressed on a actionable way of a edifice about the subject or other science basis, it is really meaningful to see the interdynamics between the practice and theory. Theory would remain insipid and inactive, and could hardly achieve a significance if they waive entire from a practice. Theory would serve in itself, but it would expand its role if we more productively apply the developed terms into a kind of a practical plane. And the views of Marxian socialist commentators on comparative law also cross-disciplinary, as I have mentioned, but have different emphasis from those of most Western writers. One of Russian legal scholars, as the Professor Sedov, is leading a Soviet comparatist. In his essay on the comparativeness of legal systems, remarked the comparison of legal systems and institutions belonging to different socio-historical types, as well as a comparative law as a whole, can only be carried out against the backdrop which is saturated with the ideological considerations. So we may have some idea about the interdisciplinary nature in the case of a socialist legal evolution. But this does not necessarily mean the political economy as determinative to define the legal system in socialist countries. The law is, in its nature, independent. A kind of attachment may be entertained in its own right. So that is also one of points we need to think seriously through the courses. Now, we may have some other prominent figures to facilitate our understanding about a legal transplant. I excerpted one of a French scholar from Wikipedia page who was responsible for drafting much of Japan's civil code during the Meiji era, and he was honored as one of the founders of modern Japan's legal system. His contribution is great to shape a new rising state of Japan in his times. Of course, finally, the Japanese system are on the German modality, but they have in some aspect have both features, kind of mixture between France and German influence. Boisson was born in Bengsong in 1825 to the famous scholar Jean-François Boisson. He was a brilliant law student, and he received his Doctor of Law with honors from the University of Paris in 1853. He may be understood kind of a missionary in terms of a legal transplant. How do you conceive about this context in terms of a political angles? In 1873, he was invited to lecture on constitutional and criminal law to some Japanese fugitives to Paris. Received an invitation to work in Japan by the Japanese Minister of Justice as one of several foreign legal scholars needed to assist with the drafting of Japan's legal codes and in the renegotiation of the unequal treaties. He also worked closely with Kanjuro and Hochimi Nobushige in drafting much of Japan's criminal and civil law. He was also an expert in international law and was legal advisor to the government in Taiwan expedition of 1874. So now Japan is considered to import a civil law tradition, heavily influenced by a German civil laws, but in this case we have some awareness about a French law in Germany. Now we have some kind of a leverage between a different legal traditions at this contemporary times. There are roughly a less case about a unilateral influence over the inferior legal system, but in his times there's a kind of a pestilence or a kind of influence to respond to the political dynamics. He returned to France in 1895 and lived in Antibus, which is located. So we may have some great Korean legal scholar to influence and provide a lesson to the legal system. I hope you can be one of hopefuls, a prospective lawyer with such a kind of influence. I now stop here for a brief break.